For nearly 50 years, the entire world was caught in the middle of an epic rivalry between two superpowers. It wasn't just a contest of armies, it was a battle of ideas, technology, and pure influence that pushed humanity right to the brink. This is the story of the Cold War, a conflict that was truly unlike any other. So here's the thing that's so wild. The central puzzle of this whole era, the two main players, the United States and the Soviet Union, never actually declared war on each other. Their soldiers never met on a battlefield. And yet, this Cold War brought us closer to total global annihilation than any other conflict in history. So how on earth did a war that wasn't technically hot become one of the most dangerous ever? Well, let's get into it. To really get it, you've got to rewind to the end of World War II. The old powers of Europe, they were basically exhausted, their empires crumbling. The entire world order was in ashes. And from those ashes, two very, very different superpowers rose up to fill that power vacuum. And that set the stage for a completely new kind of global struggle. And that's where we get the name, right? The Cold War. It perfectly captures this constant, simmering tension. It was this intense competition that always felt like it could boil over into a hot war with real, direct fighting, but it never quite did. Instead, you get this decades-long standoff. This wasn't a fight on a single battlefield. It was a global chess match played with everything from spies and political moves to absolutely devastating wars fought by other countries. You see, at its heart, this wasn't really a conflict about territory. It was a battle between two completely opposite visions for how humanity should live. On one side, you had the United States, championing capitalism, free markets, and individual liberty. On the other, you had the Soviet Union, driven by a Marxist ideology that wanted to get rid of private property and spark a worldwide revolution. These two systems were like oil and water. They just couldn't coexist. For one to win on a global scale, the other had to lose. So what lit the fuse? Honestly, it wasn't just one thing. It was more like a perfect storm. You had this raw competition for global leadership. You had the Soviets setting up socialist regimes across Eastern Europe, which the West saw as a huge threat. And that started this vicious cycle of mistrust, where every single move, even a defensive one, like forming NATO, was seen by the other side as an act of aggression. So of course they respond by forming their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. And just like that, the world was split into two heavily armed camps. Okay, so you've got the world divided into two massive, armed camps staring each other down. It was really only a matter of time before these tensions boiled over. And this brings us to the flashpoints, those moments, those crises that pushed the superpowers right to the edge and brought the entire planet terrifyingly close to a real hot war. This timeline gives you a perfect snapshot of how quickly things escalated. Look at that. It starts with a standoff over a single city, Berlin. Then it explodes into a full-blown war in Korea. And then it leads to the moment the entire world literally held its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's take a look at how this tension just kept building and building. So the first big showdown happens in Berlin. Now, the city was deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but the western half of the city was allied with the US. So in 1948, the Soviets decided to squeeze them out. They cut off all road and rail access. Their response? The West launched a massive airlift, supplying 2 million people with everything from food to fuel by plane for over a year. It was an absolutely stunning achievement and a huge political win for the West. Just a year later, the Cold War turned hot. I mean, full-on combat, but not in Europe. In Korea, the Communist North, backed by the Soviets and China, invaded the South. This was a major test of America's new policy of containment, basically stopping communism from spreading any further. This was the first major proxy war, where the superpowers would fight each other through other countries. It was brutal, leading to millions of deaths, all without a single American soldier officially firing at a Soviet soldier. And this is what it was all leading to, the brink. In October of 1962, the world discovered that the Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US coast. For 13 days, all of humanity just stared into the abyss of nuclear Armageddon. It was, as you can see here, an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation. And how we all managed to survive it? Well, people still argue about that today. It was, without a doubt, the closest we have ever come to total self-destruction. You know, the absolute terror of the Cuban Missile Crisis was a serious wake-up call. Both superpowers had stared over the cliff, and they realized they had to take a step back. This moment of clarity kicked off a new phase, a period of de-escalation that would eventually lead to the conflict's shocking and surprisingly fast conclusion. This new phase was called détente, a French word that basically just means an easing of tensions. And for the first time, the superpowers were actually talking. They set up ways to negotiate, they signed huge arms control treaties, and they even started to cooperate on a few things. For a little while there, it really seemed like a new, more stable era was beginning. But yeah, that didn't last. In 1979, the whole thing came crashing down when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a communist government. For the US, that was the last straw. All the trust that had been built during détente just evaporated. The rivalry roared back to life, sparking what a lot of people call the Second Cold War in the 80s. Then, in 1985, a new player entered the game in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev. And let me tell you, the Soviet Union he inherited was in deep, deep trouble. The economy was a mess, and it was going broke trying to keep up with the massive military spending of the US, especially with the ambitious Star Wars missile defense project. Gorbachev knew something had to give, and it had to be drastic. So his first big move was a policy called glasnost, which means openness. And this was radical. For the first time in generations, the government actually encouraged people to speak out, to criticize the system, to talk about all the problems that had been hidden for so long. It was a complete 180 from decades of secrecy and fear. His second big policy was perestroika, or restructuring. This was his attempt to fix the totally broken Soviet economy. But here's the thing. When you combine openness with restructuring, you basically open Pandora's box. By allowing just a little bit of freedom, Gorbachev accidentally unleashed forces that nobody could control. Suddenly, people all across the Soviet bloc were demanding total freedom. And the result was one of the most stunning and dramatic endings in modern history. In 1989, the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, didn't fall in a battle, it came down in a party. Then, one by one, the communist governments of Eastern Europe just collapsed. And 2 years after that, the Soviet Union itself just ceased to exist. After 45 years, the great global chess match was over. Just like that.
But look, the end of the Cold War wasn't a simple happily ever after moment. An entire global order that had been in place for 45 years vanished, basically overnight. The collapse of this two-superpower world left behind a huge power vacuum. It unlocked old rivalries, and it created a really complex legacy that, frankly, we're still dealing with today.
This quote from a Soviet official just nails it, doesn't it? For half a century, so much of the West's identity was built around not being the Soviet Union. The enemy was clear. So what happens when that enemy just disappears? It created this profound identity crisis and a whole new world of unpredictable challenges. And the consequences were immediate and kind of strange. The US was the only superpower left, but that didn't bring world peace. In some ways, it created new kinds of instability. The massive Soviet nuclear arsenal was suddenly split between 4 new countries. And while Europe celebrated peace, brutal ethnic conflicts that had been frozen by the Cold War suddenly thawed out and exploded in places like the former Yugoslavia. Which leaves us with this final, crucial question. The Cold War is over, it's history, but its shadow is incredibly long. So how should we look back at it? Was it a necessary struggle that actually prevented a much, much worse hot war between nuclear powers? Or was it just a tragic, wasteful half-century of paranoia that nearly destroyed us all? Figuring that out is one of the biggest challenges to understanding the world we live in right now.